Hi there, and welcome to our session at the Canadian Science Policy Conference. And what we're talking about is food policy, a food policy for Canada and the Food Policy Advisory Council. So my name is Evan Fraser, and I'm director of Arrow Food Institute at the University of Guelph, where I also have the privilege of co-chairing the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council, which is part of this food policy. I should begin by saying that Malcolm Campbell, who's my boss and the university's vice president of research, was supposed to moderate this session, and he sends his regrets. I just got a text from Malcolm, and it seems that that something's come up, so you're left with me. But while we're all sad not to have Malcolm on this call, I'm very happy to be speaking to you today from the traditional lands and territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, who are part of the Anishinaabe peoples. And the area that the University of Guelph is built on is part of a land called Turtle Island, and is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which was a pre-colonial agreement that reminds us all we share with one spoon the bounty of the land, which is of course the dish. And the idea of sharing a dish with one spoon, I think, is a super appropriate place to launch our conversation today about the food policy for Canada, which is sometimes known of as everyone's at the table. And over the next hour or so, our hope is to provide you with a bit of background on the food policy for Canada, as well as reflecting on one important aspect of the food policy, which is the Advisory Council. And myself and the other panelists, we're going to try to give you some insights into what the food policy is, if you don't know. We're going to give you a little bit of background on the council's work, and then have an honest and frank discussion about what's working in this brand new governance mechanism, as well as what needs to be worked on as we sort of shape this thing, which I think is a pretty new and pretty creative example of collaborative governance. And to do this, I'm joined by four, I hope I can call you all close friends, excellent guests, esteemed colleagues who are members of the Food Policy Advisory Council. First, we have Sylvie Cloutier, who is the co-chair of the Advisory Council, and in her day job is the Chief Executive Officer of the Quebec Food Processing Council. Giselle Yasmin, a long and distinguished career with executive positions at the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. Today, Giselle is the Executive Director of Food Secure Canada, one of Canada's biggest and I would say most respected non-governmental organizations working on food systems and sustainability, broadly defined. Connor Williamson, a fifth-generation farmer from Vancouver Island. In addition, an MPA, Masters of Public Administration student at the University of Victoria, and recently started a job with the BC Ministry of Agriculture. Joins us from the West Coast. And last, but certainly no means least, Joseph LeBlanc, who has a career in social and health planning. Joseph is currently the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion in the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. So thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this panel, all of you. And with everyone's permission, what I would like to do is just start with some high-level remarks about the creation of the food policy for Canada and this thing we're all embarked on, the Food Policy Advisory Council, just as a way of trying to set the scene for what we're trying to do here. Okay, so with the best of my knowledge, and I'm not claiming perfect or complete knowledge about all the ins and outs of how the food policy was created, to the best of my knowledge, the story to Canada's food policy begins approximately 6 years ago in the lead up to the 2015 federal election, when a number of forces coalesced to bring the idea that there should be a whole of government policy pertaining to food onto that new government's agenda in 2015, 2016. Of the many factors that contributed to this, there's one that, from my vantage point anyways, was particularly effective at putting food on the national agenda. And that's when the NGO Food Secure Canada established what was called the Eat, Think, Vote campaign. At its roots, and Giselle, you can provide more details in a moment, Eat, Think, Vote was a toolkit that was provided to communities that encouraged them to host all candidates' meetings in the lead up to that election. And community groups were encouraged to ask candidates questions about food security, Indigenous food sovereignty, school nutrition, and the overall sustainability of our food systems. And I remember hosting or helping to host, I think it was 2 or maybe even 3 of these events. And I was absolutely floored. I was delighted by the way in which that program engendered a robust national conversation between candidates, but also between community groups, and it really drove food onto the national agenda. And here I think it's worth pausing for a second. I think the impulse to focus on food as an object of policymaking owes its roots to the fact that although food touches on almost every aspect of our life, developing policy around it is actually very difficult. I mean, we all know that food is intrinsic to health. It's a key component of our country's trading agreements and trading programs. Producing food is the lifeblood of rural communities. Our food system drives major environmental problems. It's a source of jobs. Perhaps because of this multifaceted nature, it's both vitally important to us as a nation and as individuals, but food is also really hard to drive policy around. At any rate, those of us who work in this sector were delighted, I think, on the majority, when in 2015, the new mandate letters were revealed and we learned that developing food policy was going to be a government priority. And this led to a number of exciting initiatives. From a formal governmental perspective, what I witnessed was the government kicking off a series of consultations that included some community town halls. There was an online survey that, by all accounts, engendered or garnered much, much greater attention and engagement than was expected, with tens of thousands of Canadians writing in to tell government what we thought we wanted for our food policy. There was a summit that was held in Ottawa that brought industry and civil society together. And then in parallel with the formal government process, a number of us working outside of government came together to establish a sort of ad hoc process. It began at a small meeting that I had the privilege of convening at the University of Guelph many years ago, where organizations such as Food Secure Canada, the Maple Leaf Centre for Action on Food Security, McConnell Foundation, the Canadian Federation for Agriculture, Dietitians of Canada, all came together to try to agree on some common visions. And out of that, we coalesced around the idea that one of the key gaps, governance policy gaps facing food policy in Canada, was the lack of a permanent governance body that would report to all of government on important issues from across the food system. And we developed this idea and we talked it up. And as such, it was really exciting when the Food Policy for Canada was announced a number of years ago. And then about a year ago, everybody on this call got a phone call from the minister's office saying that we were being invited to join the inaugural Food Policy Advisory Council with a mandate to provide advice to the minister from multiple perspectives across the farm to fork continuum. Now, the council itself is made up of about 20 folks that come from multiple backgrounds and different walks of life. It spans a spectrum from poverty and food security activism through to producer groups and individuals. We all speak as individuals, but we have different perspectives within the council. And to get started, this was back in March of this year, we collectively decided to form 4 working groups, one on school nutrition, one on food waste, one on agriculture and sustainability, and one on food security. And we've met on and off over the summer and are right now preparing our first set of sort of feedbacks to the minister's office and to government. And in all of this, we've been on what I would call a voyage of discovery as we try to figure out what this new sort of policy governance mechanism is, how it can be resourced, what its mandate should be, and how it should function. And I'm really honored, touched, humbled that 4 of my colleagues from the council agreed to join this panel today to really reflect on what's worked and what's worked well, what we're excited about, but also what barriers we face and what things we need to work on to make this organization as effective as possible. So the key message that I would like to leave everybody with today is a sense of enthusiasm for this project. I'm proud and I'm honored to be a member of this council, to be co-chairing it with Sylvie. I think that the formation of the council is a fascinating case study in how non-governmental and governmental actors can come together. I think that maybe perhaps immodestly that the role the University of Guelph played in helping convene the conversation perhaps illustrates a case study of how universities can operate in convening conversations that are important to society. And as a result, I think that there's important lessons that we can learn from our experience this year and in the last couple of years that may be relevant to other types of policy making not just food and agriculture, but in other important aspects of Canadian life and policy development. So with that, I will like to stop monopolizing the proceedings, and I would like to turn first to Sylvie. Sylvie, you are the co-chair of the policy with me. Sorry? Oh, Sylvie's not on. Okay, Giselle then. Let's go turn to you then. Giselle, your career has spanned policymaking, an executive position in the Social Science Humanities Research Council. You're now a key player in civil society as executive director of Food Secure Canada. So, from your perspective, who are you, and what's your perspective on how the NGO community can, and indeed I would say must, be engaged in food policy for Canada? Giselle?
Thank you very much, Evan, for inviting me to participate today, and I'm delighted to join you all from unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory here in Ottawa, and would maybe just like to lead up and say, as someone who has been working on food systems since 1991, one of the good news stories is the change in discourse, or how we're talking about all this. When in the early 90s there wasn't that much work done on food systems from a horizontal perspective. You kind of knew everyone who was working on it, but there actually are roots that go. There are ancestors to this that do go. Thank you for acknowledging Eat, Think, Vote. That's great. It was a very important campaign, and we just had our third campaign. But if you think back to the late 70s, 1977 to 80, there was the People's Food Commission, which engaged 3,000 people across the country who had concerns about the food system, and were asking for a more joined up approach. And that had been inspired in many ways by the Berger Inquiry, if anyone's old enough to remember the Berger Inquiry besides me on this panel. And that was about, that had sort of galvanized some support for citizen-led dialogue and activism. And then subsequently there was the People's Food Commission, People's Food Policy process from 2008 to 2010, roughly 11. And again, another process where ordinary people and organizations and people from all walks of life, from all aspects of the food system, got together and started, really pushing for this more joined up food policy. And that is where a lot of work in the People's Food Policy process, some of it was on Indigenous food sovereignty. That report is still up on our website, Resetting the Table. That was a bit of a watershed moment. I'd love to hear Joseph speak a bit more about that from his perspective. So, there has been some improvement in the talk, and certainly the adoption of a food policy for Canada in June 2019 was a good step forward. The budgeting, though, was very modest associated with it, 134.4 million over 5 years, I believe it was. The commitment to a Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council is a good commitment. It's good that the committee has been named. However, one of the concerns always has to be, like, do you have the right representation around the table? Does the committee have the necessary teeth that it should have? When you look at the National Anti-Poverty Committee, for example, the resourcing is extremely different. And so does, the cynical perspective is, does this become sort of decorative multi-stakeholderism or window dressing, or does it really have policy influence? And we would like to see, and I can talk about this a bit later, but the potential to go further and bridge to various federal government departments, bridge to the provinces and the territories, municipalities, Indigenous leadership, etc., so that there is kind of a coherent approach. Just to close, I mean, there are social justice issues that need to be systematically addressed when it comes to the food system, and that are related to structural inequalities, colonialism, racism, sexism. Poverty is essentially a structural inequality issue, but then also the environmental side of it. Here we are, COP26 happening right now. The planet is burning up. There are very direct links to the way we continue, are currently producing and distributing, consuming food. And that is related to the mainstream global industrial system. And that urgently needs to change if we're going to actually even make it to 2030. So again, I think I would just say there's potential here. I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm glad that this committee has survived a federal election. We do have the same minister, so there's an opportunity to just keep going rather than engage with a new person. But what I really would hope for is like that meaningful interaction, but also impact. That this has to have impact at the end of the day. It cannot just be about talking heads.
All right, Giselle, I mean, I share everything that you said, and I'm really glad that you brought us to a broader historic perspective and put it in a wider context. I've got a follow-up question for you, if you don't mind, and that's one of the conversations that I keep getting pulled in with NGOs, with poverty activists, with producer groups, is food too big an umbrella where we're trying to deal with the structural issues of poverty and colonialism on one hand, and the more technical perhaps issues of environmental impact and climate change on the other. And there's actually, we call it a food system, but it's actually very, very different problems. And by creating the idea that it's a single thing, we actually muddy the water. I don't have an answer for that question myself, but I'd love to get your sort of initial reaction to that idea of holism versus a couple of silos, and maybe a couple of silos are useful. I don't know.
You know, it is a good question, and you know, it is a big elephant that needs to be eaten one step at a time, or one bite at a time. But there are jurisdictions in the world that have done this, and there are interesting things happening in France. I'm talking about wealthy countries like Canada. There are, you know, Korea, for example, has developed a school food program, school food programming that has multiple benefits. So that hits on the social justice, that hits on the production side through procurement, that has health outcomes. And, you know, just today in Scotland for COP, I mean, what we need and what I hope for in the speech from the throne is that we need to think of outcomes across, you know, across programs, across government departments, health, environment, social justice outcomes. So there's not one program or one department. It cannot be handled in that way. But, you know, France has all sorts of incentives around transitions in terms of food production and processing. You know, there are other examples of what's possible, and we need a rights-based approach. I mean, Ahmed Hussein, before taking on his new portfolio, in his previous portfolio, did commit publicly to food being a human right, and that all public policy should stem from that fact. He is now Minister of Housing. Housing is very similar to food in that sense, as an entitlement. We are, you know, food and shelter are human rights. And so there needs to be some policy commitments. Housing activists have been successful in that regard. I think food activists can take some cues and some from that work. And, you know, we have to take it one step at a time, look at the outcomes that need to be achieved by 2030. Canada's committed to the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2015. And so, you know, that's zero hunger, improved nutrition, and transition to sustainable food systems. So, you know, what are the metrics? What's the roadmap? It is going to take everyone, and it's going to need government and business, of course, but it also needs civil society to kind of push and do its part as well. So those multi-stakeholder solutions are going to be necessary. I would say, yes, they need to be seen together. It's not a techno fix, and it's not, it is a holistic approach, as per the name of this panel.
Great. Thank you, Giselle. Connor, can I bring you into the conversation now? You know, of this group of folks, you're the one I've met most recently, but boy, I've really come to appreciate in our 6 or 8 months of acquaintance the perspective you bring. You have a fascinating background, 5th generation farmer, working on a Master's of Public Administration. You recently hired by the BC government, West Coast. Maybe you can share a little bit of with us your personal story, farmer's perspective, and what you think the Policy Council can achieve and what its role might be?
Well, thank you, Evan. To begin, first off, though, I'd like to recognize that I'm speaking to you all from the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwanghan-speaking peoples, now recognized as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. Yes, Evan, as you acknowledged, I am a fifth-generation farmer, so I was born into a world surrounded by agriculture and a passion for it that was kind of taught to me and exchanged through me lived experiences and firsthand knowledge sharing, something that I've really come to value and appreciate, which has almost extended my trajectory into working for the SSHRC-funded research project, 4 Stories About Food Sovereignty, a transnational research project that is partnered with Virginia Tech, the University of Victoria, and the University of Antigua out of Colombia. A research project that is really rooted at my core and being and passion for food systems and food policy change. We're looking at broader questions of how do communities feed themselves, which has led me and my relationship being a farmer and being rooted in the main production side of the food system, but also combining my identity as a member of the LGBTQ community, that there are broader questions of how do our communities feed themselves, and that has extended into my questions of how does the queer community feed itself. This is a community that is often underrepresented in food system discourse, and when it is involved in this kind of discourse, it's usually around serious matters such as hunger and poverty, which should not be ignored at all, but it often puts the queer community in this position of subserviency, but also need and desire for government support and programming, and often ignores the many contributions that queer folk play in the food system beyond the role of those receiving programming and funding. And it leads me to broader questions of what kind of untapped role do we play? Where are we in this food system? Where are our community members, and what roles do they play across government as well as in different components and sectors of the food system, from production to distribution and processing? Leading me to deeper questions of how do we properly represent this community? And yes, I recognize that this is one particular community, but it feeds into larger questions of marginalized communities and where are they involved in the food system. I look forward to hearing more from Giselle and Joseph on such topics, and I know they can bring much to the table with remarks on that. So from my perspective as a farmer, I've seen hands-on the needs on the production and the discourse that occurs when you are literally out in the field having conversations about where the food system and food policy for Canada needs to go. That is greatly influenced though by my identity as a member of the LGBTQ community. And I think my main objective sitting on this council is, as Giselle remarked already, is increasing representation. That's something that I think is desperately needed for this council, but also something that this council would benefit from, is bringing in more unique and diverse perspectives that transcend different lived experiences and histories that can really influence. You know, there is a world of experiences that are impacted by the Canadian food system, and those histories really can provide a lot of useful information to us on how our food system actually impacts the lives of everyday folk and people across the food chain. And similarly, I think there does need to be a little bit more in terms of teeth for the Food Policy Advisory Council. We have the opportunity to get a lot of great things done and see a lot of great change happen. But without the necessary tools at our disposal, we once again could just fall into a silo of a think tank and having conversations that don't necessarily lead to broader systemic change. To build off of that though, one thing that I think we can increase our conversations around and potentially start to build some real meaningful dialogues on is food policy and the food system more broadly in Canada transcends multiple jurisdictions, and I appreciate the federal government's desire and passion and interest to lead this discourse. But one thing I want to see happen more at the Food Policy Advisory Council table is conversations around different jurisdictions being brought into the fold. how do we build and target different, the provinces and municipalities? How do we bring them into these conversations? Because quite frankly, they hold a lot of power in seeing any kind of systemic change at the level that we want to see at the Food Policy Advisory Council happen and occur, and bringing those voices in and having meaningful conversations with them, but also building collaborative approaches to governance will be necessary to see any kind of meaningful change occur.
Hey, thanks, Connor. A quick follow-up to you. I want to get to the issue of systemic barriers a little bit later in our conversation, but you have such a fascinating project with that 4 stories about food sovereignty, and I just would love you to just in 30 seconds just describe that project to folks, because I think it's really, really interesting. And so I realize it's a bit of a rabbit hole, but I can't not let you have a space to talk about that project.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting project. So I first got involved in it by being a research assistant with one of the investigators, Dr. Astrid Perez-Piñan, a phenomenal researcher from Puerto Rico. And Astrid brought me onto this project, and what it's at its basis and at its core of being an identity is how do communities feed themselves. We work in 4 distinct jurisdictions in partnership with Virginia Tech and the University of Antigua. We work in refugee camps in Jordan and Palestine. We work in post-apartheid communities in South Africa. We work in Colombia in indigenous communities that are experiencing active colonialism by resource development companies. And we're working in quote, post-colonial indigenous nations throughout Canada, primarily the Sauk Nation out on Vancouver Island. And what we're doing is we're building an active network of NGOs, researchers, primary producers in these distinct communities to build collaborative networks of sharing information and better understanding how these communities under different scenarios of crises are responding to them and feeding communities. We see great examples of building identity and community and culture in refugee camps in Palestine and Jordan, where these communities have been dispersed from their traditional territories and are still feeding each other. Colombia is experiencing active colonialism right now with resource development companies pushing their communities out, but still they, through food, are actively pushing back against these resource development companies and developing farms in a way to try to stop them from legally developing into their communities. And similarly, in women's farms in South Africa, how women have come across generations together to feed their communities, primarily other women who are experiencing, a range of atrocities, but still actively trying to build community in these terrible scenarios. And then Sauk Nation, who is working to reclaim food sovereignty in their territory by building in their own means what their food system looks like and how they want it to operate and function, and is seeing a revival of traditional seawater harvesting of clams and shellfish.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great project. So thanks to you and that entire team that you're a part of for that work. I think Sylvie is on. Sylvie, I'm going to go to Joseph first, and then we'll come back to you. Joseph, goodness, you and I have done a lot of work together over the last 5 or more years. You've helped me administer award programs, and we worked together on a sort of a learning process to figure out what COVID meant for the food system. So I have learned so much from you in our interactions, and I'm so grateful for everything that you've shared with me. You've always been very gentle in teaching me things. I want to open a conversation up that picks up on both Giselle and Connor's points about representation. And you have the vantage point as the only Indigenous member of the Food Policy Advisory Council. You also, of course, have a very senior academic positions, Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. I think the audience would really like to hear a little bit more about your own personal story and what you think the Food Policy for Canada can and should aspire to. Specifically from the perspective of increasing representation and equity. Joseph? And I'm not hearing you, Joseph. All right. All right. All right. Well, Joseph will hopefully sort your technical issues out in a second. We seem to be plagued with technical issues today. Sylvie, welcome, my comrade in arms in the Food Policy Council. And I can hear you. This is wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
You're from industry and you're from the Quebec Food Processors Association. I mean, that is a very different kind of role than I hold, or Joseph, or Connor, or Giselle. So, you know, let's bring you into the conversation. What do you think the food policy should aspire to? And what role does the processing sector have in this conversation?
Well, I can start with the processing sector in Canada. As you know, the food and beverage processing industry is the second largest manufacturing sector in Canada. In terms of value of production, it was in goods, sales of goods manufactured, almost $118 billion in 2019. And it's the largest manufacturing employer and provides employment for almost 300,000 Canadians. It's also the largest manufacturing industry in most provinces. So for Quebec and Ontario, for example, they account for about 62% of all sales and production and sales in Canada of foods. And it supplies 70% of all processed food and beverages available in Canada, and buys, it's the largest buyer of our production or agricultural production. I think food systems, including the way food is produced, processed, distributed, consumed, and disposed of, they have direct impacts on the lives of Canadians. Food systems are interconnected and are integral to the well-being of all, of public health, environment, sustainability, and strength of the economy. So despite the wide range of actions being taken by government and stakeholders over the years, issues exist in the Canadian food system, such as food insecurity, access to healthy foods, or food waste. So these are important challenges that require many aspects and solutions. I think the food policy was developed to guide food-related decisions and actions, and in an approach to understanding and addressing the linkages within the food systems and plans for making decisions about foods. So the Food Policy Council brings together diverse perspectives to support the implementation of the policy. And I would say that food processing is a big part of it. The council, the role is to build consensus and help identify the gaps and opportunities and bring advice on the food challenges and solutions to address them. So also help to build greater trust amongst key food systems stakeholders and support the ability to collaborate across sectors. Again, the food processing industry and beverage are integral parts of the food systems and the solutions that we can bring around the table.
Super. Well, I mean, maybe a follow-up question to you too then, and it's the same one I pitched to Giselle, in that sometimes it feels great to have this food systems lens that combines farm to fork and all the steps in between, and
yes.
and the stuff that you know best occupies a pretty big chunk of that space between farm and fork. And other times it feels like we may be muddying the water by trying to take too big a bite out of things. And again, Giselle's comment about the elephant and one bite at a time. What's your sense as to the merits of a food systems lens versus maybe more of a targeted approach to policymaking?
Can you, I'm sorry, I missed Giselle's part of it, but can you just explain it a bit more?
Well,
sorry.
I mean, here we have this huge food system that has all these actors and all these activities that go from, input suppliers through to consumers with these issues of race and equality and power ridden through the whole thing. And at other times it feels like, and sometimes it feels like we should be taking that as a thing, as an overarching concept and tackling that system. And other times it feels like maybe we should be focusing on elements within that system in order to be a little more targeted, as to not, the old expression, don't boil the ocean, don't try to do too much. And it's sort of that holistic versus reductionistic debate. And I'm just curious as to what your perspective might be on that.
On the food system or on the food processing per se?
Yeah, well, in we're developing policy making, is
Yeah.
it better to sort of go big, or is it better to be more granular in our aspirations?
I think more granular. There's a lot to tackle right now in Canada, in the food system, and in the when we're talking about food insecurity or waste or very specific areas. I think we need to go more granular. We do have to have a larger vision, but we will be able to tackle each of these issues by going granular and trying to solve each of the problem within the components of the food system.
Yeah. And in a sense, that's sort of what we sort of tried to do when we divided the Food Policy Council initially, and for its first phase of work, into 4 working groups, each of which was a little more granular. Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yes. We really need to tackle the issues by going deep within the food system and going granular.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks. Joseph, I think you probably can connect in now. Are we able to hear you?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Oh, loud and clear, my friend.
Excellent.
So,
okay, great.
My question to you, just to recap, was, really focus in on your role as an expert in equity and inclusion, because that's what your day job is. Also, your role as the only Indigenous representative on the Food Policy Council. And I would just like to give you the floor to reflect on how do we increase representation and these sort of issues. What should we aspire to as a Food Policy Council?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak to that. And I generally, I've been reflecting on this a lot. I kind of see food work as a lifelong endeavor. Certainly, whatever roles I'm in, we try to bring that in because it's important, and it certainly, relates right back to the rights conversation. So I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of Anishinaabe Nation. I'm near to Nipissing First Nation, which is within my own family's traditional territory. And, ultimately, I think, that connection back to place and culture and community is really important. And, when we talk at the Food Policy Council, it often feels very removed from that, even the conversation to say, Canada's food system or, the agri-food system, this is where I think that role continues to be to say, well, Canada has multiple food systems, a mosaic of food system, Indigenous remote rural communities have that commonality of connecting with natural resources and forest and freshwater, ocean-based food systems. And so, I think that as some of my peers have said, right, granular, I like to say distinctions-based approach to this discussion. And, generally, I think in Canada, one of the requirements to address, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and others is to shift to a rights-based framework. We tend to use this term, stakeholders, and we engage with all groups, and particularly industry or agri-food or others as stakeholders. But in reality, the implementation of the spirit and intent of UNDRIP, UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, will require a shift to a rights-based framework. And that will be, I think, a significant shift to understanding that there are people and communities and nations with vested interests in the land. There is ongoing colonialism and ongoing genocidal acts in the food system. It's very clear that policies that emerge from a market-based or stakeholder framework continue to protect those interests as opposed to valuing the rights of individuals, within those frameworks. So ultimately, I think, the work at the Policy Council to be more inclusive and recognize, bridging some of those barriers will need to be a philosophical shift. Some of that is in, like I said, how we view stakeholders versus rights holders. The other piece, I think, around equity is recognizing that if we want various voices at the table, we have to support their ability to be there. And so, compensating for time, for example, understanding that we value diverse perspectives and investing in what that means. And so, at the same time as saying, there's a voluntary committee, or this is, a voluntary commitment, just in those statements and in that positioning, we exclude people. And so if we want to have, BIPOC communities, if we want to have representation at the table, we have to support that ability to be there and to show up and value what those voices are bringing to the table. And then, furthermore, I think, our relationship with decision makers is troubling. As a member of the council, I do have, concerns when the minister comes and speaks to us and then leaves, and then we're dependent on bureaucrats to relay, very important information through the chain and through their own lenses of bias and lived experience and other things. And so I do question, the efficiency or the efficacy of doing something like that in that way. But I'll reserve some more comments on that for later.
All right. Well, a quick follow up to you, and thank you for all those remarks. I really do appreciate it. I would love it if you could, and maybe I'm just getting academic on us, but we're both working for universities, so maybe we can indulge ourselves academically for a second. Can you define a rights-based approach for us and to make that a little clearer? Because sometimes I feel that we use that rights-based language often, and A, I'm not sure that many people understand exactly what we're talking about, and B, I'm not even sure when I say rights-based approach, or Giselle says it, or you say it, we're all necessarily saying the same thing. So from your perspective, what is a rights-based approach, and what would it look like on food?
Yeah, so I mean, it probably does look different from different perspectives. The right to food is articulated in different mechanisms. There are women's and children's rights to food, which can be implemented in particular ways. But as we look at what is what's called legally Aboriginal and treaty rights, right? These are articulated in the Constitution. When we look at case law in Canada, particularly around natural resource management, there is a requirement to prioritize the rights of Indigenous people above the interests of commercial extractors, right? And that doesn't mean to the exclusion of those parties. But for the most part in Canada, our economy, and I live and work and travel around Northern Ontario. We are essentially one very large mining and forestry town. We're an hour apart from each other, but that is rural Canada. Is that most of these communities were built to support the extraction of resources out of this territory, whereas Indigenous nations and peoples have a long-term invested interest in those natural environments. And so when we look at the application of a rights holder framework to natural resource management planning policy actions, is to say, rights holders' interests first, and then the interests of other stakeholders. And that doesn't mean, like I said, that doesn't mean there's going to be no wood taken. That means that there's going to be food and the ability to have clean water and the ability to live the life that was described and agreed upon in the treaties first. And that co-development of that management is, I think, the ideal goal. So things like community-based forestry, shared natural resource management, and setting extraction limits for harvesting animals, for example, participation in that process. But really right now we have two distinct systems where natural resource management is a provincial undertaking, Indians and lands reserved for Indians are a federal undertaking, and there's a mismatch of sort of policies across the country as far as how those rights are integrated into management planning. So what I'm talking about is rather than looking at Indigenous interests as stakeholder groups, we're looking at bumping that up into a rights holder. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. Okay, next round of questioning. Giselle, let's jump back to you and get you back in the conversation. We're at the start of a new government. What would you like to see as key priorities for the food policy in general, the Policy Advisory Council, and how would you like to tackle, or would you propose tackling the barriers that that perhaps we face? Giselle?
Well, what I'd like to see, and my understanding is speech from the throne is November 22nd. I would like to see commitments to really getting to the root causes of food insecurity, and to an actual written commitment that charity is not the solution, that this is a social justice issue. It's an entitlements issue. So food, like housing, food and shelter and that having signed on the UN Covenant, Economic and Social, the rights for the Economic and Social Covenant, I forget the name, but way back in the 40s, Canada already did sign off on this. And the state does have a responsibility to look after its population. So I would like to see that commitment, obvious commitments to Indigenous food sovereignty, recognition also that certain communities are disproportionately affected. I would like to see commitments to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but also actual commitments to keeping soil and water and pollinators and all of what we need to produce food. Canada's a big food producer. To not be destroying ourselves in the process. So a real commitment there. And I would like to see that then trickle down into mandate letters for a number of ministers, not just Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, who's responsible for food policy for Canada, which is a cross-cutting horizontal dossier. It's not relegated to one department, but Minister of Health, Minister of Housing. We now have Minister of Housing, right? Who knew, right? Ahmed Hussein, this is big news. Minister of Environment and Climate Change, etc. And for that to be kind of those dots to be connected through their mandate letters, as well as following through. We are very close now on school food. There was a commitment in budget 2019 for the federal government to discuss with provinces, territories, and other stakeholders. And we certainly would like to make sure First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and nations are meaningfully consulted as part of this. We lost traction a bit for a while. It was, now hopefully it will come back. There were promises in two party platforms, the Liberals and the NDP. There's a real opportunity here, and I would like to see that trickle down into the work of the committee. I would like to see more transparency as well, the terms of reference, even if they're, often reviewed and whatnot. Maybe some proceedings being publicly shared. And interactions with other committees and other departments across government, other jurisdictions, et cetera. So, how are we going to get to 2030? We really only have 8 years. If we're going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, there's already been concern from the Auditor General that Canada's not on track. Of course, Canada can't do it alone. I totally agree with Connor. The provinces and territories are huge, huge, huge players in this. And we need to have nation-to-nation approaches with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but also recognize, other systemic inequalities. Women, obviously this is supposed to be a feminist government, so that needs to land in terms of the intersectional 50% of the population, but also, Black and people of color, Black communities, people of color are also disproportionately affected. I just want to put a shout out for City of Toronto, biggest city in Canada, just passed a Black food sovereignty strategy policy. And, the chair of our board in her day job has been a big part of this. Others have struggled for this for many years. So again, it has to be with communities, not for communities. There needs to be that food sovereignty approach where people define their own systems. It's not one size fits all, not one size fits all. So there has to be that recognition of the multiplicity of realities if you're going to make a difference on the ground, and work with people who are working on the ground and know what's happening.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Giselle. That's great. And you sort of queued up Connor. So Connor, same question to you. Giselle sort of set you up, pitched it across your plate. What do you think our priorities, our government's priorities should be, and how do we overcome barriers and obstacles?
Well, I just want to say I echo many of the, if not all of the 18 or so commitments Giselle put forward that we should have. I think there's more than 18. There's a lot there, and I loved every single one of them. I think a lot of them were doubled up with what I was going to say. But one of my initial ones I hope we can make a commitment around is building a more comprehensive and effective data collection framework that really dives into the granular components of our society and our community, and what the needs of specific regions and subsects of our population are, and diving deeper into, you know, those marginalized communities that have multiple intersections around race, class, and gender and sexuality, and properly gathering data that is representative of the multiple facets of Canadian society that really shows you, you know, this is what the picture is when it comes to things like hunger and poverty. Leading to my next thing that I hope our government can make commitments around, but is a more comprehensive hunger reduction strategy. Because in a country such as Canada, the fact that we even have individuals who are experiencing periods of hunger or not starvation, but hunger, pardon me, it's alarming and concerning when we export a plethora, where exports are a huge component of our economy and food system. And the fact that we have the opportunity and the means to do so based on the fact that we are a wealthy country to reduce hunger in our own territory, but we have yet to do so, and we still have that problem plaguing our communities. It's quite frankly disappointing and just sad that that is something that people have to live with. And I want to acknowledge that that is something that queer folk, especially queer folk of color, experience the most, is that hunger is something that results in people having to make decisions around taking HIV medication or seeking out food. People who are, you know, experiencing HIV oftentimes have to experience and participate in risky behaviors so they can acquire food, which can exacerbate diagnoses and other infections and health complications and problems. So building a comprehensive hunger strategy that can target communities and actually alleviate those problems and see a complete elimination of that in Canada would be something I would like to really see our government try to champion and bring other jurisdictions on board. Similarly, developing programs for mentorship in agriculture, something that as a farmer I've experienced and loved, and I know many people who've worked in the food system appreciate, is you learn so much from shared knowledge from those with the lived experiences in that system and in that position that you're looking to enter into. So as a farmer, I learned much from my grandfather and my grandmother about farming, and that I recognize is, you know, common across, you know, Indigenous means of knowledge sharing. But I think when we try to talk about bringing in new people into the food system and expanding the labor force and, you know, making agriculture seem as though it is actually a productive and fulfilling career to enter into, and it's not just something that 7 days a week you're in the mud, that still rings true. Building effective mentorship programs that attract young people from different marginalized communities and backgrounds into the food system, really breaking down the systemic vision that agriculture is this heteropatriarchal, white-dominated industry, and bringing in those different folds of community into it can start to then help bridge the conversation around how do our respective communities feed each other, and different communities of different walks of life and representations beginning to have those conversations and working towards that vision of like, I want to build a system that is reflective of my identity and my being and those who share that same identity and being with me, and helping feed each other. Now, that shouldn't happen on its own and be the only means to build a sense of community and feeding each other like a food sovereignty approach, and having those conversations up at the larger, high level, you know, minister's office stage would be beneficial, but that is one component. So I'd say I leave it there, but also want to echo everything Giselle had said before. It's all ambitious, and I want it all to happen.
Sounds good, and thanks for bringing in that mentorship component. That's super important. And wearing my university professor hat, that's something I spend a lot of time working on. Not the farmer to young people mentorship line, but training the next generation is so very important. Hey, Sylvie, let's get you back into the conversation. What do you think the priorities should be, and how to overcome the barriers? Over to you, my friend.
Well, I'll echo what Giselle and Connor just said. To that, I would add that we needed a vision that will be embraced by all. The problem we have right now is everybody's working in silos, different departments, provinces, territories. We're all doing our own thing. And those small projects right now are not bringing real results. We need to innovate the way we're doing things. Clearly, right now, we have not tackled the real problems. We talk about them all the time, but we have not brought solutions. We have not innovated in the way we're doing business, or we're bringing food to Canadians. So we need to do that. I would also add that we need to tackle food waste. It's maybe the only thing Giselle did not mention, but food waste is a huge problem right now. We saw reports not more than a couple of weeks ago that states that we waste about half of our foods. We need to tackle this issue because it's a real problem. Environment. Right now, we've been seeing problems in the prairies and on farming with the environmental issues and the how do you say that? Sorry, the temperature going up. What's the term in English? Sorry.
Climate change or global warming?
Yeah, global warming. Sorry. It's been a very, very big problem. Water is a big problem. We see it here out east. I'm sure we see it everywhere. So these are issues that need to be prioritized by our government.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And I'm glad you brought the waste issue in, because I was thinking, how am I going to get waste into this conversation? It hasn't appeared yet, but thank you for doing that. Folks at home, audience members, I'm going to turn to Joseph to ask the question in a second, but if you want to ask questions of the panel, there is a live Q&A function in this platform. Please start typing your questions in. What I would propose, friends, is that, Joseph, I'm going to ask you to answer the question. We'll take any audience Q&A questions, and then we'll have one final statement about what makes us excited to wrap this up. So Joseph, from your perspective, hoping your microphone will work this time, what do you think our priorities should be, and how do we overcome barriers?
Well, can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Yeah, I struggle with this one. I think that the philosophical shift is needed, and we're at this time of truth and reconciliation, and certainly need to recognize that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was focused on one act of assimilation, that was the residential schools. We haven't had a truth telling around land and economy and what the implications are of the acts that took place, and so I think even having that in a national forum of some kind, bringing awareness to, the fact that, we do produce a lot of food in this country, yet we have a lot of communities with food insecurity. And that, we have this sort of like dual reality where it's very hard to hear of the excess that's wasted. It's very hard to hear of plans to extract, to export and extract, while at the same time, communities in our country that, really are feeling that continued colonization and continued, genocidal policies, right? And I mean those words very clearly, right? In that the level of clean water in communities, the activities that are leading to population declines and collapse in certain areas. Moose populations are collapsing in Ontario and Manitoba, and these are serious implications. So I think some type of truth process is needed to understand, and then a clear path towards reparations. If we were to look at the cost of this and what this really looks like, certainly policies like Nutrition North are reinforcing the control that external corporations have in community. And there are initiatives like the Northern Ontario Indigenous Food Sovereignty Collaborative, where after 15 years of pulling together partners and funders, we were finally able to launch and provide Indigenous households with grants to support food sovereignty. And I think a look at the philosophy behind granting and foundations. I think I was quite vocal critic of the 100 million and how that went out around COVID into 5 charities that had very little relationship with Indigenous communities, and then again, very little interest from anybody in looking at how that money actually rolled out. So ultimately, I think we need to have the difficult conversations that we tend to shy away from in this country, and we need to look at those solutions that are emergent from community, and those are people that are experts at living with food insecurity. They're dealing with place-based consequences of permafrost melting or ice roads seasons reducing, crashing, like I said. And so that adaptation really needs to happen at the community level, and we need to get our funding aligned to support what's going to happen at the household and community level to navigate this change, because certainly external programs, cookie cutter solutions haven't worked, and certainly solutions that are dreamt up in isolation of our lived reality tend to just sort of reinforce that colonialism. And so I mean, for a long time I've been thinking about, and we've tried a few different times, but a temporary northern worker program. I mean, we bring people in from all over the world, and at the same time have high rates of poverty and unemployment and the need for skill development and other things. So how do we build those relationships where we have food going north instead of south, or whatever the chain of distribution is? And then how do we disrupt the role that corporations and capitalist enterprises have taken in the north, and work to help to rebuild local economies? So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us. I think it starts with that truth telling. I think it starts with Canadians being vulnerable. I think it starts with our institutions being willing to hear where perhaps they need to get out of the way, including government, and where we can then move to a future where, and again, it's a colonial narrative, but we can trust that Indigenous peoples know what is needed for our communities. And like I said, a lot of it is just get out of the way.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Audience, questions for the panelists? I'm not 100% even sure if it's possible to ask questions. I'm assuming it is. I don't even know where the questions will pop up, but I'm hoping someone tells me. All right. Okay. There we go. Okay. So Emma, thank you for breaking the ice on us. I'm going to read it out so everyone can hear it. A significant barrier to integrated resource management is the division of responsibilities between the federal, provincial governments, as outlined in the Constitution. For example, this is especially relevant to agricultural water use as rivers, water sources between jurisdictions. How can we overcome this barrier in targeting systemic change to improve food security? So federal, provincial, constitutional issues. So not an easy question right off the get-go. Does anybody want to try to tackle that thorny issue, which could be said, paraphrased as, welcome to Canada. This is part of the rules of engagement. I mean, for the sake of pointing at somebody, I'm not seeing anybody leap. Joseph, do you want to? Yeah, okay. Do you want to jump in on that one for us? Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'll try my best, because I did mention this in my earlier comments, and I think that it is a particularly unique Canadian challenge, is this this jurisdictional divide. But there are national interests as well, right? And that we're having this conversation around school nutrition program, for example, right, where there are federal interest mandate layer, but education happens at the provincial level. So there needs to be that interjurisdictional conversation and leadership, but it's a two-way street, right? And once you get into like the issue that I brought up earlier, natural resource management, and what you're touching on here as far as water, it really does speak to the compartmentalization of a Western worldview. Like, that water in the rivers and in the ocean is in the land too, but that interchange gets sort of divvied up to say, okay, navigable waters are a federal responsibility, whereas smaller streams and other things are provincial, and ignoring the fact that that same water has movement and has spirit and is able to move within the boundaries that we draw. So we do have to tackle I think a national project of decolonization. This is not a uniquely Indigenous undertaking. I think it touches on a lot of the major challenges that we deal with today in Canada: electoral reform, interjurisdictional issues, trade between provinces, all of these things, because we're still living with the legacy of somebody who arrived to this place, divvied it up from a perspective of an outsider looking in with the interest of extraction. Now that we have multiple generations of Canadians who've grown up here, I think we need to decolonize our systems. And I know that's not an easy answer to the question. I'd love to say, here's a switch that you can switch and then you can deal with this interjurisdictional challenge. But I do think it's an opportunity for many of us, whatever that perspective is, to start to look at the application of colonial perspectives into our own lives. And you'll find them at University of Guelph, you'll find them at running a nonprofit and a charity, and we find them running farms and agriculture. But have those conversations with elected officials and start to look at what does a Indigenous, and I mean that by saying emergent from place, an Indigenous governance system in modern Canada look like. And it would look nothing like what we have today. So I think it's a challenge for all of us.
I like that phrasing. I really like that phrasing. What would an Indigenous as an emergent from place? You've given me something new to think about. As usual there, Joseph, thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on the Fed-Prov constitutional issue? Giselle, it looks like you may be nodding your head.
Jump in. And thanks to Joseph for his pithy remarks. The map has changed, though, in my lifetime. I mean, I lived in the NWT 1981. None of it didn't exist at that time. And there has been devolution of power. And there is this new Nunavut Inuit Foods Sovereignty Strategy, which is out. I find that hugely exciting. And yes, all these provinces and these are kind of legacy issues, but at the same time, faut que je parle pour les francophones un peu aussi. October 1970. Okay, I remember October 1970. I'm old enough to remember October 1970. There was violence because of the status. There are layers of colonialism in this country. I mean, there was the Indigenous people since time immemorial. Then there was the fur trade. There was the French presence, and there was the British conquest. So Quebec is doing really exciting things. I mean, we don't talk about that enough in English-speaking circles. They're doing really interesting transformational work in terms of the food system and whatnot. So we also need to, I think, acknowledge and look at that. And there are examples. Again, I'm an optimist, but of the Georgia Basin strategy, for example. I lived on the West Coast for many, many years. It's more of a watershed type approach. Like, how do you manage your watershed or your food sheds? And it crossed over into the artificial U.S. border. So we do need to tackle these things. I mean, the joke is it's easier to trade internationally than it is between provinces. I mean, that's ridiculous. So, we have to redo our supply chains. And I know we're going to have final remarks. I'll save my food loss and waste comment for that. Evan?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A. Sylvie, I didn't see you or Connor wanting to jump in on this question. So maybe, with your permission, I could turn first to Sylvie and then to Connor for the first words of the last words. And Sylvie, what gets you excited or enthusiastic about the work of the Advisory Council, about the food policy, about the things that we can maybe accomplish in the next year or two? Sylvie, and then Connor, and then I'll go Giselle and Joseph in that order.
Well, we have tackled very important issues. Most of them have been talked about today, and brought together people from different backgrounds, and that bring this knowledge and expertise around the table. So I'm very excited about the 4 working groups and what we're about to bring to the minister and to the group in the next few days. And hopefully this will have a real impact on the future of the Canadian food policy. Everybody around the table has given a lot of time, energy, and we're looking into a national school program, food waste, food insecurity, and environmental issues, sustainability. And I'm very happy of what I've been seeing to this day from the group.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. And I really share everything you just said. I'm excited about those things as well, and acknowledging the very serious barriers as well. Connor, over to you. What do you think gets you excited and jazzed up and ready to go about the next couple of years of our work together?
Well, I'm excited that we're reconvening. That's something that excites me, is us coming back together collectively. The election had me with bated breath thinking, oh dear God, what's going to happen to us? Are we going to exist? Here we are again. Whether you like it or not, we're back. One thing that excites me is that Farmers for Climate Solutions embarked on an endeavor to call equity-seeking and equity inclusion-seeking focus groups to conduct research to really understand, like, what do these targeted communities need in terms of programming and resources and support, and provide these recommendations to government. So I am excited to see that we have other organizations out there really championing these calls for equity and inclusion that hopefully we can actually take note of and hear back from, and then take on that torch and walk it through further in broader questions and conversations around equity and inclusion in the Food Policy Advisory Council itself, in terms of representation, but also in terms of the work we do and the recommendations we are providing to the minister. That's it for me, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And I just say here. I mean, I really, what you just said really resonates with me. Giselle, what do you think?
Maybe I could just offer a few random thoughts, probably not put together very coherently, but I've been following the COP26 discussions. There is lots of discussion around food systems transformation from all sorts of quarters. That gives me some hope that it won't just be talk, hopefully, that there will be action that comes out of it. Yes, the committee's back. I mean, as Shirley Chisholm said, the only Black woman who ever ran as president of the United States in 1973. If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. So, I mean, we have to, I mean, it's not perfect. We need better representation at that table. But, 40 years ago, I mean, no offense to anybody around the table, but you would have had middle-aged, privileged, white Anglo men only having these discussions. So, to have a better balance, we do need to get better without question. Food loss and waste, because Cindy, is right. I didn't talk about it. Hugely important that we're finally discussing this. There are people who spent 20, 30 years in their career trying to get focus on this, and we are talking about it. It must be tackled. It puts an end to this idea that this is about food production. We can't feed the world, we got to produce more food. Not true. But it is not a solution to food insecurity. It isn't. I mean, it's a supply chain issue. We cannot couch it as a long-term or an effective solution to food insecurity, because that's not what it is. But we do have to absolutely tackle it and do better. And I just want to end with a quote from the Eat Lancet report that was pre-COVID. Food is the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth. And, you know, I didn't write that. So, you know, it's really, the time is now, and we cannot, for our children, we cannot afford to dither. We need action on the ground. And I agree, Sylvie, we need the big vision, we need the outcomes to be clear, but we need to move forward in pragmatic ways. Ensemble, comme on dit. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Giselle. And yeah, I mean, I mean that quote that you read from the Eat Lancet report, that food is the big lever, is really the sort of the whole reason that I got into this racket in the first place, is that it provides a window and a lever onto the big issues. Joseph, over to you. What in the next phase gets you excited about making progress on?
Well, I think, like has been mentioned, it's good it exists. I mean, we've been fighting and asking for this for a very long time. I remember, you know, Food Secure Canada gatherings in the 2010s and all this, you know, working through what that would be, and now we have it. And I think in general, I think it's on us now as members to try to make it as best it can be, right? And you're right, there 40 years ago, this I mean, even 4 years ago, this would not have been a mechanism for that conversation. So, you know, I think respectfully, you know, acknowledging that it exists and there is this opportunity is important. What I'm looking for and forward to in this next phase is hopefully an engagement with some of what I've been asking, which is a, you know, more diverse membership and some support for, you know, some people to come to the table that otherwise wouldn't be able to. But also, you know, the implementation and integration of community articulated strategy. So you mentioned the Nunavut's food strategy, and the Nishnawbe Nation has one as well. It's 50 communities here in Northern Ontario. There are a whole bunch of them across, and the reason why those are made is to say, you know, this is our plan for our food systems, and that's where government can then say, okay, there's some leadership here. So, you know, I'm hopeful that there is a continued philosophy to work away from corporate food interests, and that seems to be the case thus far. But, you know, I want to see the same occur in Nutrition North Canada, for example, and some of the other initiatives that'll be moving forward. So, yeah, I'm keenly looking forward to you know, participating in the implementation of this, but also you know, holding to that perspective that we do need to decolonize these mechanisms. And I'd love to see the minister stick around for a meeting and, you know, engage with us conversationally. I'm hopeful for that day.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Joseph. And yeah, wise words from you and from all of you. So I guess it falls to me to try to tie a bow or wrap a ribbon around this session. And for me, it's sort of three core take-home messages. First of all, if you are listening and you are part of government, I hope what you hear here from this panel is that in the Food Policy Advisory Council, you have a resource. You have a critical resource, a friendly resource, a resource of passionately committed experts who are wanting to make things better, broadly defined, and are willing to help and be unvarnished in our advice. So I hope anyone from government that's listening to this important discussion at the Canadian Science Policy Conference will get a sense that there is a resource to be drawn upon here to everybody's point and what Joseph just said. Second thing I'm hearing from my friends on the call is that while we're delighted that the food policy exists and the Food Policy Council exists, and we think Canada is better off with us than without something like a food policy, and we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we don't want to delay until we've got everything perfect before moving forward. We also don't want to stop working towards perfection and working towards a better, more inclusive, more just, decolonized society. And then finally, last word for me is just of humble excitement about this project we are all embarked upon together. It's not easy, it's not perfect, but it's definitely worth doing. And I'm so excited to be engaging with the folks on the call, the rest of the council members, colleagues from Ag Canada, other departments, on things like creating a school nutrition program for Canadian youth and Canadian kids, given that we're the only country in the G8 that doesn't have one of those things. Working towards reducing food waste and getting climate change, carbon emissions out of our food system, working towards a decolonized food system that is more sovereign for our Indigenous communities. So with that, I think I'm just going to wrap things up with a profound thank you to everybody, audience, organizers, but especially the Food Policy Council members that joined me today. Thank you very much, everybody.